this computer. Okay, so welcome everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar names join for this wonderful event. And if I look somewhat distracted, it's just because I'm still admitting people in who have the link and trying to make sure that we're not missing anyone. I do ask if you could turn off your video as you enter, that would be great, so that we can make sure that we see everyone. And and then we're going to be asking questions, later on. So you'll definitely have a chance to be able to, raise your hand and all of that. All right. So we're still getting people. We had a lot of people register for this event. So close to, I think it was over 200 people. So that is a very good number for ATA. And we are, thank you to the 3 artists that are joining us. We are recording this talk. So if you know friends of yours that, oh, where's, so-and-so, that just let them know that the talk will be made available later on and loaded onto our website. So, all right. So I think we have most of everyone in. I'm just going to say a few little words. Again, thank you for attending our first artist conversation, featuring 3 artists included in the current exhibition Beyond Tapestry Expanded, which is on display at DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana. And we thank DePauw immensely for their support. The exhibition is partially curated by Erica Warren and juried by Alexa Griffith Winton and Jade Umain. It will be on display until December 8th, and for those in proximity, we hope you have a chance to view it in person. It has been wonderful to see it in person, and we also have an accompanying catalog. So we hope that you can check out our website and be able to order one today. Yes, thank you, Paja. So it is a nice catalog, and it really does have a wonderful description of all of the artists included in the exhibition. So what I'm going to do right now is I am going to share my screen because I am going to give a brief introduction to each of the, here we are, to each of the artists, and get me out of here. So let me just put this so that we can see. Okay, and I'm going to close my window and sorry, I'm just going to admit everyone. All right. Lots of, okay, I think that's it. Okay, I think I'm going to go from here. All right, so I'm going to begin with some artist introductions. I'm going to begin with Janice Lessman-Moss. Janice is a weaver who embraces the unique vocabulary of digital design in relation to the binary functioning of threads on the loom to create her art. She has been awarded numerous individual artist fellowships from the Ohio Arts Council and won the Governor's Award for the Arts in Ohio in 2016, the Cleveland Arts Prize Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019, and United States Artist Fellowship also in 2019. Her weavings have been presented throughout the United States and internationally. A native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Lessman-Moss resides in Kent, Ohio, where she is Emeritus Professor of Art at Kent State University. All right, let's see. And then we're moving to Paja's work. Pazia Mannella is an assistant professor and fibers area head at the University of Missouri-Columbia. In 2023, she presented her creative research at Praxis and Practice, a digital weaving conference, Praxis Fiber Workshop, Cleveland Institute of Art, and Kent State College of Art. Her work has been included in exhibitions such as the World of Threads Festival in 2023 in Canada and published in Digital Weaving Norway, Dutch Textile Plus magazine, U.S. Airways magazine, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I'm just going to put this really quick. And then finally, our third artist that we're speaking with today is Hope Wang. And she is a multimedia artist and creative entrepreneur based in Chicago, Illinois. Her practice explores memory, loss, and longing in the ever-shifting architectural landscape. She is interested in capturing what always feels out of reach, the last seconds of sun setting against the factory wall, wavering shadows fluttering against the pavement, and the transient space between an open storefront and a shuttered one. She is also the founding director of Loom Room, a digital weaving project space, center for community resources, and gathering place which serves the textile arts communities of Chicago. Most recently, in 2023, she was awarded a Visual Arts Fellowship from the Lumen Arts Cultural Foundation, as well as a Chicago Community Fellowship Fund from the Breakout Foundation. And before we get started, I am just going to let everyone in. Okay, great. All right. So thank you all three of you for joining this conversation. And I wanted to begin this conversation. I'm actually going to switch to this image right here. Move this little guy over here. And I wanted to think about and have us look at and consider the history of textiles as an evolutionary and even revolutionary medium. And so what we see here on the screen is a fragment with tiger and bird on floral ground. It's from China, from Xinjiang, 13th century. It is a silk tapestry weave, something that many of us are very familiar with in the tapestry world. And it is part of the Kotzen Textile Traces Study Collection. And as we know, there are many ways to create woven images, and there's a rich history of woven imagery from cultures around the world dating thousands of years back. One familiar with textile history understands the evolution of image making and weaving as a constant state of flux. For example, Lee Talbot, a curator at the George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum, Washington, D.C., highlights this example that you see on the screen here from 13th century China that demonstrates a dramatic departure from warp-faced to weft-faced imagery. Talbot writes, another technique that arrived in China along the Silk Road was tapestry weave. The tapestry weave technique seems to have originated in ancient Mesopotamia and spread eastward over the centuries. I'm just going to put those people. The earliest tapestry weaves in Central Asia were made of wool, but by the Tang Dynasty, weavers in this region were producing tapestry woven textiles made of silk. Woven around the 13th century in Central Asia, present-day Western China, this example in figure 6 that we see here features a blue tiger, gold bird, and multicolored flower blossoms and leaves. The pattern reveals active international exchange with the stylistic influences from cultures to the east and the west. Talbot demonstrates the technical exchanges that take place as a result of trade along the Silk Road from the west to east. And today we see a myriad of technological influences in art, from AI generation imagery to the TC2 loom, which all three of you have used to create image-based woven work. And so with that, I have a few questions, and I'm going to actually stop my share screen right there. And my first question is both first to Pazia and Janice. Since you both have a rich history of academic teaching and a vibrant fibers program, can you speak about what trends you may have been seeing or have seen with students when it comes to their interest in weaving? For example, are they drawn to weaving as an extension of drawing, painting, or other form of image making? And what snags them into learning about the process? How does your teaching lean into this, or how does it direct their learning? And how have you evolved as an artist from your experience as an educator in the field? And does it push you to want to learn new skills? Have you been forced to go down rabbit holes that you might otherwise not have gone down, or incorporate different processes that you would have otherwise have considered? So I'll let you two take it over for a little bit.
Pazia, why don't you start, since you're currently teaching and you're in the classroom, you might be able to talk a little bit better about what you're seeing in the students currently.
Well, and I just want to share that I have benefited from learning about weaving from Janet and at various points in my life. So I think I'm in debt to you, Janice, for some of this educational learning. And I think something that really struck me, Maggie, as you were speaking about that particular tapestry in the context of sort of the work that we're presenting within the exhibition, I think all of our works become some expression of like culture, material access, technology. And I currently teach weaving and paper making. Um, but I find that the students don't always have the opportunity to really like master a technique like tapestry. Right now, I'm teaching tapestry with one group on a frame loom and one group on a floor loom. And those technologies are different. However, you can achieve a lot of the same things. And I think a conversation that we were maybe starting at the introduction is I really agree with Hope's statement or an expression of this idea that like TC2 weaving or digital weaving can really be like an introduction into some of these crafts. And I will say when I was a student, I found like sort of the end goal of tapestry to be very lost to me. Like I could do these like studies in a sampler. And I find that now that I'm working on a digital loom and I'm using that technology, it has supported my teaching and weaving in a very different way. So even though I might not always be teaching the students how to weave on the TC2 loom, the ways in which I weave across these technologies are really like linked, I would say. And I feel like the students really are driven to combine these ancient techniques with this new technology, and I find a lot of excitement there. Um, so that's sort of a starting point for me, Janice, and maybe you can share some of your thoughts on trends or on sort of the interest. But I do find that I have students really interested in doing handwork, and it's something that I enjoy to do. I think one of the reasons I am weaving is because I love the process of weaving. And when I can see a student kind of fall into a technique like that and master it, maybe at a student level, it is very exciting.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a little out of it. As many of you know, I retired from teaching 2 years ago, so I'm no longer in the classroom. I loved every minute of my teaching career and try to stay connected to the program as much as I can and to what students are doing. But it's a different animal when you're not in the studio every day like Pazia is. But you know, one of the things that I noticed prior to leaving teaching, I thought that when introducing the TC2 loom and digital weaving would kind of overtake all of the the interest in working on the frame loom or on the shaft looms in the studio. And in fact, that was not the case. Not everybody falls in love with the digital loom. They still value, I mean, we know, as we were discussing prior to coming onto the screen, we still have to do the work on the TC2 loom. And so it's the combination of digitization and handwork, but students do like that handwork. One thing I would say I kind of wanted to add was that, you know, one of the greatest assets of working with textiles is its portability. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, we become involved with textiles, where it historically has been a woman's field, because it's easy to do wherever you are, or some of the processes, not all, of course. But I always looked at that as a disadvantage as an educator, because I really like the sense of community that is created by everybody working in the same space. Now, of course, you can do that with a frame loom, and we did. And we did that with all of our techniques. But at the end of class, students would head off to their dorms or homes with their frame looms or with their basketry techniques, with their plating, whatever. And I really did not like that because I wanted the students to be in the studio, and I envied my colleagues in ceramics and in jewelry metals where the students had to be in the studio to work with the equipment. So of course, one way to do that is to get students on the looms. And at Kent State University, we had a lot of looms. We still do, over 40 shaft looms in the general studio area. And that gives students an opportunity to create a community, to create friendships, to help each other, to ask questions. You know, learning is exponentially increased when you are in an environment, in a community, an environment where other people are sharing in your experience. And certainly, isn't that why we love teaching, is that opportunity to share in the joy of discovery and to, you know, to be able to share our knowledge. So that's one of the things that I felt strongly about, was introducing students to working on the floor loom. And they may kind of have entered that experience kicking and screaming and not wanting to be in the studio all the time. But ultimately, you know, you convert a lot of students who just fall in love with the process. And of course, not everybody does, but those that have that, you know, kind of zeitgeist, then they just go for it. So. Oh, and just one other thing, sorry. I was just gonna say, just the final part of your question, Maggie, was about the, you know, learning from the students or learning with the students. And of course, I think Pazia and I would both agree wholeheartedly that, you know, you have to stay one step ahead of the students by always exploring new techniques, you know, reading, studying, and certainly from my perspective, beginning my teaching career without a real strong foundation of knowledge in weaving, but loving it. You know, I spent a lifetime, a career at Kent State, really learning new techniques. And when we were given the opportunity to purchase a TC1 way back in 2001, you know, I didn't know how to use it. So it was a big challenge for me. And that challenge, of course, changed my life and the trajectory of my practice. But, you know, again, that's another joy of teaching. Always the challenges that you face as an academic, trying to be the best teacher you can be and to keep the students abreast of what is happening in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Janice. Like you mentioned, if there are times when we don't want to fall down those rabbit holes, and there are times that I'm like, oh, I don't really want to show someone this technique right this moment. But I agree that by engaging as an academic artist, like it has really allowed me to be a lifetime learner, and I am so inspired by my students, and I feel like I stay very sharp in techniques because I have to explain them to beginners on a regular basis. And I have a lot of actions that are muscle memory, but I can't rely on that as a teacher. I have to explain my actions to a group of students.
Right, that's great.
Yeah, so true. Well, great. Thank you for that answer. So my next question is a little bit more directed to Hope. So you are instrumental in extending the knowledge network of weaving by creating Loom Room. And for those who are not aware of what Loom Room is, would you mind just sharing a brief summary of that? And within your role there, how have you seen people come to image making through weaving? As one who functions outside of the academic world, how do you see knowledge being gained and transferred from one artist to another?
Thank you for such great questions, Maggie. Okay, so I'll answer first what Loom Room is. I'm actually currently inside of Loom Room at the moment. And Loom Room is a space that is parallel to my artist studio. So half of this studio space is my own artist studio, and then the other half houses a TC2 loom, as well as a floor multi-harness floor loom. And I can just spin over here. So this is the floor, this is the TC2
Beautiful.
that we have at Loom Room. And Loom Room functions outside of the academic space, largely to provide access to tools that are expensive, require a technician or a certain amount of technical knowledge to maintain, and also require a lot of space. And in a lot of ways, I think I really resonate with sort of the considerations of that academic space. Is that I went to art school, and that's where I was introduced to weaving and fell in love with it. I learned on a frame loom, and then moved to floor loom, multi-harness floor looms, and then found the TC2, and I loved all of them. And leaving art school, the academic space, and the institutional access, the resources, I still wanted to have that kind of camaraderie that Janice talked about, of learning and working together in the studio, and to have that sort of the joys of discovery still be impactful rather than us all sort of disappearing into our own artist studios. So Loom Room was born from that, to create a space that, while it exists outside of academic institutions, it still feels like a landing space, or a space where we can continue to share knowledge with each other, and to research and discover new things within our practices in a collective space. So the tools that we have at Loom Room are made available for rentals to independent artists, and we also do workshops and lectures and different kinds of programming to really emphasize contemporary weaving as a art practice that is on the same like rigor and level that other like multidisciplinary artists are working within. So that's what Loom Room is. Sorry, that I don't know if that was very brief, but
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah.
I think as my role as founder, and also the facilitator of access to the loom, which kind of means that I am sort of the knowledge holder in many ways now. And I'm also sort of, I get to have the privilege of connecting a lot of different people to each other, in terms of like, oh, someone comes in and they have an interest in a particular thing and they don't really know where to start. I'm like, oh, there's somebody who was here in the studio 2 months ago, and they're a colleague, and they would love to like connect and share. So I think that's like such a privileged space to be, not necessarily as an educator, but sort of as an extra module in the space of education, in the space of artistic growth. And so I think that the way that knowledge is sort of transferred between people at Loom Room is often more one-on-one, simply because, as many of you know, only one person can be at the loom at a time. If we have more looms, that would be amazing, but that's a slow process of acquiring more equipment and having more people sort of overlap with each other. But I think that that's where our workshops or our lectures are opportunities where we can have a sort of a classroom or a sort of open forum for people to share knowledge. But otherwise, it often is sort of like me, maybe my co-director, Murat Ahmed, or another artist who might be helping us within the studio, or who might be subbing for one of us when we're like providing access to the tool. But I think that it's kind of an amazing sort of one-on-one experience where it's very relational, of like, I'm sharing all the observations that I've gotten to accumulate from everyone who comes through the studio. So I think that's one really like a really, I feel like a big role on my shoulders. But also I think it's a really sort of amazing component to my own artistic practice. I have learned so much on my own about the TC2, about weaving, and about like all kinds of new techniques, just seeing how other people solve problems within our space and working together. So like Loom Room is also kind of a space where I feel like, Janice, you and I talked about this when we saw each other last month
Right.
at the opening of the Beyond Tapestry Expanded exhibition, where we were talking about like expertise, how in many ways I think a lot of beginners or people who are new to a discipline, they don't really know the extent of which they don't know. Everything is so new, and then when you get to an intermediate sort of space, like you start to know what you don't know. And then as an expert, everyone will say like, I don't know anything. I'm guided by people who are also students who are learning, and we're just guiding information along, and we can only share the experience and the knowledge that we've had. And I definitely, like, Paja and Janice, you've, been teaching and are in this space much longer. But I think it's really, yeah, I think Janice, we were talking about like, yeah, guiding information and sort of just stewarding that in this way that really helps people all make discoveries that you personally would not have even if you knew that information. So I think our hope for Loom Room at least is to be able to augment that experience and to extend it beyond just academic spaces.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. And I think it's such a valuable thing to be able to provide. And, that's one of the roles that I think ATA really offers and provides their members, is an extension of that learning environment in various capacities and just a sense of network, because I'm sure that most of people ATA members who might be listening right now, they've learned so much from each other and from other tapestry weavers, and have traveled probably, to international places to learn things, and have brought back skills and continue to share. And so much about that is, through that communal sharing and that sense of, exchange of knowledge that really broadens and deepens our understanding of everything. Because, weaving is endless. I think whether you're a production weaver, a textile designer, a tapestry weaver, fine art producer, like there's so many different realms in which you can go in. It's possibilities are endless, as we kind of all know. So, all right. So I have another question, which is, and this speaks a little bit to kind of the role of technology and how that's impacted our practice. And so throughout the history of art, technological advances and discoveries have played a huge role in determining what is produced. For example, printmaking methods developed by Albrecht Dürer created an entirely new world where drawings could be replicated as engravings, and thus allowing artists to potentially sell more of their work, as they could produce drawings at a faster rate. And the invention of modern photography in the 19th century further changed our relationship and the understanding of image making, of course, which is very important. And textiles have had a long tradition of evolutionary changes, such as the introduction of the jacquard loom, which of course is a precursor to the TC2 loom. And with each introduction of new technology, there's always adjustment in how society values these new methods, what they want to preserve and keep, the products that they produce, and, the fear of losing the knowledge of very specific skills that are really passed down through generations. I mean, we just talked about that first tapestry that we looked at, with the acknowledgement that, that specific tapestry technique comes from Mesopotamia, right? So that's millennia. And in how do we kind of preserve those techniques, but then fuse them in together with new technological advances that you're seeing?
Well, I'll start if that's okay. I would just say that, seeing that image, Maggie, it did kind of really resonate. The beautiful piece, and those tapestries from that era, of course, are amazing. And so many tapestries throughout history, from the Peruvians and the Chinese particularly, are just amazing. But one of the things that technology, I think, has allowed us to do, whether it's particularly the TC1 and the TC2, is to make images with a little bit more accuracy, or with a little bit more fluidity. And I dare say speed. Of course, traditionally tapestries took years and years, and it's nice that that's not the case anymore. But I don't think we choose weaving because of its expedience. I still think it's a very slow medium. But, you know, for me, I mean, technology and weaving, of course, go hand in hand. And as I've said in my statement, and I think, you know, we've mentioned, is that binary foundation makes for a clear connection between our tools, our computer and our looms. And for me, they are ultimately, you know, one and the same thing. I do build from the basic building block of that intersection of warp and weft, which also is represented by a pixel on the computer screen. So that's the smallest structure, and that smallest structure of weaving is the smallest kind of module in the computer screen. And that's the basic part of it provides the foundation or the springboard for the development of the other matrix that I use in the development of my abstract systems, using curves and using diagonals. Structure becomes one with image. And so for me, using that, both the warp and the weft in my work is really where the fun comes in, the pattern comes in, the texture comes in, the variations come in. The fact that I make parallels with walking in my work, and I look at both the design of my compositions as very much building in a linear way, although engaging both linear and circular time in the way they develop. And the way we engage with the loom is also kind of acknowledging that sense of linearity, because we are accumulating, we are building, much like when you're walking and you're moving slowly through space, and you're building, you're observing, you're seeing what's happening in front of you. The same kind of thing happens on the loom. So technology is a tool that allows me to realize what I want to say in my work.
Yeah, it really resonated with me when you mentioned the pixel, Janice. And I said this sort of in a broad way, but I met Janice as a visiting artist. She was a visiting artist at my undergraduate school when I was probably very early, like semester 1 or 2 into my fibers education. So I had this introduction to digital weaving where I really felt like someone was speaking a language that I didn't understand. And it took me many, many years to even like have the confidence to ask Janice to teach me how to operate a TC1 at Kent State. So I really do feel like, you know, this wasn't part of the talk, but I do feel like I've benefited from my education with Janice. And I remember learning about making weave structures in Photoshop, and it is truly just that pixel mark. And I think that, you know, you mentioned the linear aspect of weaving. And, you know, I was listening to this podcast on paintings that have been translated into tapestries and the history behind that. And how by observing something in a tapestry where you're building it up line by line, it allows you to observe in a way that you don't when you're painting or you don't when you're manipulating a form. So I think, you know, I'm utilizing discontinuous wefts in my work. I'm utilizing things that are used in tapestry, like floating, different like knotting techniques. So I do feel like my work is really grounded in an understanding of how color mixing happens through weft application. Um, but I really do view any loom as a tool, whether it's weighted at our body, weighted on like stretched on a frame, the shafts, the TC2, the jacquards. They really are just this introduction of additional technology. However, the action doesn't shift that much. I think it's also interesting when you're working in image making with weaving, the materiality shifts so much depending on the weight of the material, the intersection with the warp, or, you know, traditionally in tapestry, we don't see the warp at all. But I really do feel informed by a lot of tapestry processes in my work. I also feel like the weight of a non-functional woven, like the idea behind that, to put something that is non-functional and have it stand as an art piece, um, I think that that really aligns with sort of the idea behind, like, at least European tapestry, as I understand it. Yeah, so that's a little bit more about my interest in that technology, and I feel like in academia and many other places, we're always asked to be more productive, like to speed production, to consume, to output. So, like, I guess an interesting question that arises in my mind is like the TC2. For some may, speed up this production of weaving, but it hasn't necessarily for me. So I feel like speed and output is not the reason I work on this particular loom myself.
Mhm.
Yeah, I really resonate that with that as well. I mean, like Janice said, or nobody really picks weaving to work, in a fast manner. And um, like for myself, I also do other things. Like I have a photography and a painting background, and that's what I, um, had. Those were the interests that I had prior to meeting the loom, and those are much more instantaneous. And I remember people being asked, like, oh, why pick something that has constraints, or why something that's so slow? When much of what they understand, what conceive with art is this like sort of free-spirited, like gestural kind of spontaneous decision making. And I think that actually, when you have constraints, such as the grid, or the being forced to dress the loom first, or being forced to have a lot of understanding of your material, there's a lot of slowing down that is really important for artists and for people in general. We live in a world that really asks us to produce a lot, and to produce as much as possible, and to produce as big as possible. And I don't think that that's always more valuable. I think um, being forced to slow down, to really acquaint yourself with the threads, and to um, understand how your body is shaped around a tool, or how you shape your movements around anything, is actually really necessary to creating pauses, for us to consider what's important to us. Why are we taking the time to make something? So I think there's a lot of like love and care that's put into that sort of the slowness. And at the same time, when I think about it within my own artist practice, photography is sort of that instantaneous thing that I do. I take photos every single day on my phone, because that's the thing that we all have at our fingertips now. And I compose an image very often in response to painterly gestures, very instantaneous gestures out in the world. Um, I love that we have so much crossover in just our works too, where Janice, I like so much of my work is also in response to walking and observing the world, absorbing it, and seeing how other people leave marks in the landscape. And mine is very much like the industrial landscape, where there's a lot of people always leaving all kinds of like marks behind. But yeah, I think I'm often composing things in a really instantaneous way. And weaving is a space where I'm like, okay, I've accumulated 200 images of shadows on the sidewalk. And I find that in observation to those like more low stakes gestures, and moments in which I'm capturing this subject, I find that I'd love to make a weaving out of it. And I think that there's something beautiful about that slowness of marinating on a subject for 2 years, accumulating fast photos, prints, maybe making paintings of them, and then deciding that you want to take on another language, which is through the loom. And I see that all of these like processes and different technologies and different advancements or operations on any tool is just another like language that augments other information that we have. Um, and so for me, I love weaving because it's kind of this extra commitment to be like, I'm still really intrigued by this moment of curiosity out in the world. And I'd like to weave something line by line and think about how color and light and material through yarns or other kinds of like wefts that we use could really capture something that photo or painting doesn't. I talk a lot about how, to me, I think like yarns really talk about color and light in a way that, again, like a photograph or even paint doesn't, because I feel like yarns sort of woven into a textile operate more similarly to like light particles than like pigments being mixed to convey color or space or time. So I think that that's something that I think that anyone who takes the time to make something with their hands, there's like a lot of um, care and intention in that, whether it's fast or whether it's slow. But they're just different languages. And I think something that I've also talked about with the TC2 specifically is that it is, at least in my experience and the people I've seen, it is the tool that, because of some of its efficiency or its recognizability to a generation that is familiar with pixels and computers and Photoshop, it is kind of like ushering artists who would not otherwise be interested in weaving in the history and within this craft. And it's really bringing large swaths of people into the conversation where they're like, tell me more about textiles and history. And like, I get so many people who will wander into Loom Room during our open studios and be like, oh, like, um, I remember my grandmother who like had these like Thai style like woven bamboo mats during like our like whenever I would visit them. And is this the kind of loom that like this is the kind of weaving that's happening here? And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure your Thai grandmother is probably not using a TC2 to weave her mats, but I love that you that evokes something for you, and that's a way to connect with us. And I'm like, I'd love to hear more about that. And I think it's a really great moment for folks to be like, there's something I'm related to, there's textiles in everyone's life, and there's something that it's related to my life, wherever you look. And I think that that's a really rich conversation to experience just through this spaceship loom that definitely was not part of that textile history. But I think it's really special that it could be the thing that really reinterests people into techniques that have been lost or histories that have been sort of put off to the side in the larger collective consciousness when it comes to things that are made in our contemporary life today.
That's a great answer to that question, all of you. And I think each of you already spoke to a little bit about my final question, which was thinking about materiality and responding to that materiality and thinking about, I love what thinking about line by line and building up of something in accrual of time in a way, in a very visual and physical sense that I think is very different than painting, and that you can almost literally measure, time. And so I know a lot of weavers think about that time encapsulation through their process. I would say my final question to you would be like, how do you, I mean, is there a way in which you're thinking about your production that feels, or is there a connection to it that is somewhat like drawing in that sense, in that mark making sense, in that physical representation of an image, whether it's a line that you're, really working through, or I don't know if that pertains to what each of you are doing through and so I just put that out there.
I guess a way in which I'm working, and I was thinking about how Hope was talking about photographs and painting. I think that one of the really lovely aspects of making files for a digital loom is that like I use my drawings, I use photographs that I take, I use found imagery. Like it really sort of is like by putting that into selective color and dropping weaves into that selective color, it really does sort of allow an artist to combine a lot of different ways of making mark, whether it is hand mark, whether it is a digital mark, whether it is a photographic mark. So I think there's a real power to that. I think some of the speed is another thing that really drives me. So even though I'm working slow, just the way in which the image can be sort of manipulated through the structure, um, speeds up the process quite a bit. Um, but there's still things to be found, and I find that the way in which the image is created through this process, I have found my own hand in some of the patterns that I select, some of the materials that I select, and the texture and the surface of a weaving is not a smooth surface like printed photo paper or the acrylic of paint. It really does handle the light differently. And Hope you were mentioning like sort of the way in which like the color mixes in the loom. I feel like I've only experienced something like that with like very tedious tapestry techniques where we're doing like gradation or different like dot marks in order to create an image. I find that I can do a similar mark making that I have in like floor loom weaving or frame loom weaving on the TC2. My hand in weaving like translates across those
Mhm.
those technologies, I would say.
Mhm. Well, I will add that, for me, I mean, the drawing is such an expansive kind of word, certainly nowadays. It's not just pencil to paper. And for me, drawing on the computer is, what I do. And I look at that as drawing. It's both methodical and serendipitous, but the things that the generative kind of capabilities of the computer allow you to do, it is astounding. And how you find things differently through working with layers and through working with transparencies or a myriad of other kinds of tools that are on the computer in Photoshop. That's what I use. And so that is where I find my true expression is with the computer as a drawing tool, and then to translate that drawing into the physical reality of a textile is of course the most exciting part. And people say, well, I do digital drawings, and people say, well, why don't you just end at the digital drawing? But of course it's the output, that manifested thing that you have in front of you, that is, as Hope was alluding to, and as Pasha also, thinking about color and light and texture. I always combine kind of shiny versus matte materials, sometimes very shiny when I use my metal, so that the play of light, the play of perspective is very real in our work. And depending on how you look at the work, from which perspective, from near, from far, from right, from left, when the illumination changes, you get a very different experience of your weaving. And I think that that's a very exciting aspect of our medium. It is very fulfilling for me as an artist to take my drawings from that virtual reality into this physical reality.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a really good, I love that kind of what you're talking about, thinking about that, going back and forth almost into this digital space to the real space. There's this kind of fluid conversation that happens with each of that I think is really interesting. Yeah, well, those are all the questions that I have. And what I would love if everyone could hopefully mute themselves. We have somebody that is, has their microphone on.
Còn ê làm sao để
Me, okay.
ý là cái động tác mà Phi
There we go. I think I found the person. Anyway, if you have a question for either of our artists, either of our three artists here, Pazia, Janice, or Hope, if you want to just drop that into the chat, that would be wonderful. I know I can't be the only one with all the questions. I'm sure there's somebody there that.
Can I just say while we're waiting?
Sure.
You know, I thought it was interesting when Hope mentioned the notion of constraints, and I tend to look at what we do as with the loom as being more kind of parameters rather than constraints, because they do provide, and I think, you know, she was spot on with that observation of, you know, we have to kind of contain our content, but I don't look at it as any kind of a you know, it doesn't prevent me from doing anything I want to do. It just provides those kind of boundaries that allow me to focus.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I actually think that like parameters or you know, having a box, at least like knowing those things is really useful to knowing exactly how far you can push things. And not to say that there's limitations or that it's more constrained than anything else, but or that yeah, there's an issue even with that. But I think it's like
Right.
really there's a lot of freedom to play and to know very intimately like what all the kind of components you can do. As you both probably know, there's so many variables that could go into anything on the loom that I just don't think that there really are constraints. I think that there's like opportunities to respond to structures. But I think that like even across two people, even if, you know, for us, we work on a digital loom where technically if you gave me your file, I could weave it as well, right? But what's really beautiful is that, as many people don't know, you actually, someone has to hand weave this file. So it's not that we're all just giving it to the same kind of loom, but technically I could get those coded instructions. And if you gave me exactly the yarns that you wanted me to use, I could make it. But I think that there's something beautiful about like, you know, Pasha, when you were talking about also like drawing based on the materials you're using, I was thinking like, yeah, there's often times where I don't go in to a weaving session with a plan on exactly what materials I'm going to use. I have an array of cones in front of me that I'm like, you know what, like, what if I inserted this like gradient orange stripe at this moment, just because I'm feeling it as I'm weaving. And I very much kind of design like that too. And so that's where even for myself, like there's been times where I've tried to stitch two panels together where I really have to record very strategically, like exactly those spontaneous decisions that I make. But I think that's what's beautiful is that everyone, even if given the same instructions, the same weave drafts, would make decisions differently. And that's where the drawing or the hand or the artist comes in. And that's what's beautiful than to design a really, you know, functional design for the loom and just having that sort of like taking yourself away from that process of it actually being made. I think what's beautiful about the TC2 is that you have the opportunity to stop and to make some completely different decisions or to even combine different files and structures together. Like I often also do that. So I don't know, I like to kind of think about it as sort of stitching of decisions that can happen. There's a little bit more flexibility with a jacquard loom. But ultimately we're always still kind of like making our own idiosyncratic decisions.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that answers a question that was asked of like why TC2 loom versus a floor or tapestry loom. And the one thing being, I think, is that flexibility, right? To kind of really literally change in the moment versus, being maybe set within a certain structure. That at least with, if you have some kind of pattern happening with a floor controlled weave, that otherwise it'd be a little bit limiting. But yeah. So another great question is for somebody who might be just starting out and is new to the digital and hand loom, the learning curve feels very large. And what can you say about being patient during that process?
The learning for what? For the digital or for
I think let's just say the digital, like if you're just kind of trying to make the leap into that and yeah, just how do you maintain the patience for learning each one little building block at a time, I guess.
I think, I mean, as Hope alluded to with her comments about the loom room, if you can do anything on the computer, which everybody can nowadays, and if you can upload a photograph, you can turn that into a weaving. And I think the kind of the miracle of that and, the discovery that happens with just translating an image into a structure. So making it a pattern versus making it a flat kind of surface image. I mean, it's kind of miraculous. And Pazia, you probably would agree too. I mean, if you're teaching that and you see that happen, it's like the light bulb goes off and you take things in stages. So nobody needs to be intimidated by it. Nobody, you don't have to jump in and make the greatest piece in the world, but you will be excited and amazed by the things you can do with just a little teeny tiny bit of knowledge.
Yeah.
I think like in response to the question, I feel like all weaving is an accumulation of these small commitments to like movement and decisions. And I think that like as weavers, like it's always built on patience, whatever loom you use. Of course, the Photoshop aspect and the new technology presents something new, which I think most people are not always going to be comfortable just jumping right into something that they haven't done before or are unfamiliar with. But I'd say any weaving is really just like all built on patience. And I think that the learning process is very much like, yeah, one step at a time. So sorry, Pasha, you were going to say something.
No, I think as it relates to TC2, I do really feel like what you're doing, Hope, with the Loom Room is opening it up to an audience beyond the academic umbrella. I feel like, there is some gatekeeping that happens just by having this loom in an academic institution. And I think like opening up the access the way potentially Loom Room has done through rentals is really exciting because it doesn't require an artist to have such rigorous training or like basically my understanding is the experience with you sort of supplements some of that training and that skill gets shared. I think in terms of like tapestry weaving, the book that I recommend to my students and would recommend to anyone, and I believe this is like a American Tapestry Alliance artist, who is involved is Tommy Scanlon's recent tapestry book. And I think it is set up like a design language course, basically going through the principles of design, what is often covered in foundational coursework at an academic institution. But there's some beautiful images and just really good instruction on true tapestry skill. So I would say for those who are more interested in learning that technique, I will say my embracing of a weaver, like being a weaver, took me about 20 years to be like, I'm a weaver. And there are days when I'm like, am I? But I do feel like anytime you're working on the loom whether it's your little cardboard frame loom or the TC2 loom. You're building skill in the technique. And one of my favorite books to share with students is Twyla Tharp's The Creative Habit. And it describes art making as a practice. And having observed Janice's studio practice, like it is a daily practice. It's something that if you want to do it, you can do it, but you have to build the skill and you have to do it regularly. You can't like kind of drop in and drop out. And Tommy Scanlon also does weaving every day, a little bit of tapestry weaving, and she has a whole project on the accumulation of that over an annual period. And I really do believe that as artists we have to work. I don't get a divine inspiration ever. My cartoons or my designs are not like but I try and work every day in my studio.
Yeah. Yeah, putting in the work, that's for sure. So, what do you see next in your practice that is exciting to you?
Well, I just painted a warp, a long, 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 long warp, and I've got a drawing in my studio. So I'm ready to go with some large weavings. I've been doing a series of small weavings, which I have been posting on Instagram, inspired by Pazia and also Hope, with all of their kind of interest in keeping everyone informed of what's going on in their practices. I try to do that. I'm a little bit of an old timer, having begun teaching before the personal computer was really even in anyone's homes. So I'm excited about that. I have some plans to do some bigger pieces, and that's always fun. I alternate because the small pieces are fast and they're fun. Not that the large pieces aren't, but they take a lot more time to develop.
I will say I've turned my loom over to Tally Weinberg, who is a accomplished weaver in her own right. She's here at the University of Missouri as our university artist in residence. So we are able to have someone come in, different programs. And this semester I was able to have Tally for the entire semester. So not directly about me, but about, having artists interacting with students, sharing this knowledge, observing others working. I've learned a lot from just observing her on the loom. And I think that's something that, like, again, we are mentioning over and over again about that exchange of information, that exchange of skill and knowledge. I'm on day 21 of Inktober. I started to do that in honor of my husband's niece who passed away 2 years ago. She passed away in the middle of completing Inktober. And if you're not familiar, it's a daily worded ink drawing prompt. Over the course of October, it's every day for 31 days. So doing an ink pen drawing when I'm a weaver every day for 31 days is out of my comfort zone. But the act of doing that has inspired a lot of ideas in my weaving. So I plan to continue doing it for the rest of my life. But that's something that I'm like, we're 10 days to go, and I'll be glad to have a little breather room after the end of October.
That's so admirable. I feel like doing anything for every day straight is really so special. Yeah, I think for me, at least, so through Loom Room, we just have been sprinting this whole year. We just opened Loom Room to the public. This is the first year of that, so we were establishing a lot of programs and doing artist collaborations, publications, and yeah, every time we have a new warp cycle on the loom, I also get to squeeze myself into there and just throw something onto the loom. And so I've been really kind of enjoying that pace, but so much of my creative headspace is very much through facilitating Loom Room and thinking about what other artists to work with. And so I've been kind of enjoying letting myself like my own personal work kind of just like pop up a little bit in between those like frameworks or structures that I've set up through doing work within a communal studio setting. But I also we've been kind of bit by the painted warp bug. And this year has been a lot of sort of playing around with our setup of putting dye painted cotton and silk, yards and yards of it, like 20 plus yards onto our loom, and just playing around with it. So we are planning to probably do something like some sort of collaboration within the next couple of months, but I'm kind of just looking forward to resting at the moment. But I am also working on my own artist book that has been sort of a slow process of just collecting poetry that I've written over like the past 10 years, and different images that I'm inspired by, and sort of collecting that all into a book. So yeah, I think for me, my working pace is always just like little tidbits of things here and there. But yeah, I think I'm really very drawn to what's possible through getting to observe other people weaving while at Loom Room. So yeah, I'm kind of like similar with you, Paja. Like I'm just like, we don't need to talk about my work right now. I'm like really excited about what other people are doing in my space. So yeah.
Well, and I think it's both an extension of yourselves, right? So in that sense of collaboration, which is so important and inspiring, and it circles back around, you know, and I love the fact that all of you are doing or have mentioned things that feed your practice that aren't weaving, right? So which I do think is very important. And yeah, so that's great. And I know that there seems to be some interest in Loom Room. So one question is, I see all the Loom Room programs are sold out. How many people are in each session? So, you know, and I, you know, maybe, yeah, I'll just let Hope answer that. So,
Yes, and they are, I'm so grateful for all the interest that we've had. The sold out workshops are because we usually have a capacity limit of 15 people, which is like a, you know, an intimate class, but like that's as many people we can fit into the studio. And we hope to have more of them um, over next year to increase more. But it is a challenge to balance organizing workshops that are all led by visiting artists, and then also managing rentals of independent art projects from all kinds of artists who travel all over Chicago and all over the country, and some from out of the country to come weave at Loom Room. So all I can say is that I would really highly suggest that if you're interested in Loom Room's programs, to be on our newsletter, and to check your spam so it doesn't go to your spam, because our programs have been pretty popular, that they do sell out like really quickly, even when we open them up again, which is so special. But yeah, I think our hope is that we can do more of them, but they are pretty like well attended. So yeah, just stay updated with us.
I think some of the conversations that happened around, there was a TC2 digital conference that Hope and Janice and I all were presenters at, but I think it really did open my eyes to the accessibility of the loom. And, you know, I had a lot of individual access to the loom because of my position as a professor at the University of Missouri and writing the grant to get it. But I think some of the conversations that were happening, including sort of that idea of, you know, the academic setting being a place to learn the technique, but maybe you don't have the access after you leave. It inspired me to think about potential, like, you know, artist residencies, and it would be shorter term. It wouldn't be a rental necessarily, but I do think opening up access to this loom is really like, it's something I want to see, and it's something I want to do as someone in an academic institution, just because it is such an amazing tool. And I do feel like it can sometimes feel like, unless you have a lot of money to buy one for your own studio, that where you would access it is sort of an unknown. So it's something I certainly don't claim to have solved, but it's something I certainly have thought a lot about since that conversation happened. And I think that the fact that there are institutions like the Loom Room and Praxis in Cleveland where you can go and work, and there often is, you know, either a fee or an application process with Praxis, but that others can have the experience of working on these looms. It's not just you weave all night as an undergraduate and then you never can use this loom again.
Yeah, I think that there's so many ways to address accessibility of this tool that it's actually pretty we're just beginning to think about that, because I know this loom came online and into everyone's purview pretty recently. I mean, Janice, you really stewarded a lot of that, and I know so many students coming from Kent, like, you know, only have amazing praises to say about how generous you were in terms of being intrepid about like, okay, yeah, like I have no idea what this, you know, tentacled thing with all these tubes and air coming through it, and like, but I'm gonna figure it out and I'm gonna get other people excited about it. And I think that as someone who's experienced that undergrad experience of like, wow, this is so cool, and as soon as I graduate out of this institution that I'm paying a lot of money to attend, I'm not gonna get to continue that that learning. And I think that when you're in school, you only just start to like grasp the surface, so you can't really get too deep. And I felt like that was such a unfortunate thing that um I wanted to also puzzle through how could we maybe um sort of remove some of those barriers that would exist in an academic space. And then like it is very self-selecting, like there is still a fee, there's still a lot of commitment to weaving on a TC2 loom or just in general equipment that you don't own yourself, that I think allows people to be really inventive about what they do when they're on this loom outside of an education space, or outside of when they're kind of stuck within some of the bureaucracy of academia as even faculty sometimes. So I think, yeah, I think like Loom Room for us, we're just trying to try one model, but I think we're all kind of in conversation about how we get people to explore this tool more fully and how we sort of exchange that knowledge together. So but yeah, I think there was a lot of fear for me as a student to be like, what am I gonna do? I love this thing, but like how do I keep making on here? And I think that it's really admirable to see how everyone, even with you know, as faculty, when you're like, oh, can we invite other artists to be in here to use this tool? How can we sort of play with the access as a tool itself to explore our practices?
Yeah, and there was another, this will be our final question. I don't know if any of you know this, but is there an estimate on how many tapestry artists are creating on the TC2 right now, or just how many TC2 weavers there are right now? I feel that that's a Vivek question.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, it's hard to know because within the last several years, of course, a number of TC2s that have kind of popped up around the world, and now they have some new artists who are training to help those of us that have any troubles or questions about working on the TC2, if we have any kinds of concerns, technical concerns. So they're really growing. And as I understand it too, what's interesting, and especially in light of my belief that although I think it's great that anybody can really kind of learn to weave on a TC2, that the knowledge of textiles, the knowledge of weaving really does provide you with a richness to what you can do with it. You know, and so, but I do understand that some schools who do not have textile programs, or they're not locating the TC2 looms in their textile programs, they're locating them in their tech labs or their fab labs or whatever, which is a very, you know, kind of different animal. But I think the popularity is growing, and well-deserved popularity, because it's an amazing tool.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for your generosity and giving your time to have this conversation. It's been very fruitful for me to, I of course have had the pleasure and luxury of seeing the exhibition, seeing all of your work in person, and then some of you who came to the opening, which was wonderful to chat and reconnect. And I do think that these exhibitions that are organized are so important because it does strengthen those connections, initiates and strengthens connections, and fosters definitely a sense of shared communal space in which we're all here supporting each other in that way, and that is what makes I think the overall weaving community really wonderful to be a part of, is that there is that sense of kind of open source, sharing exchange that happens. So thank you all so much. And with that, I'm going to end our recording.